having me. It's always such a joy to do anything with CMCS. Yeah, I'm quite happy to be here. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you guys see that yet? Yes, excellent. Okay. I'm going to taskbar you guys. I don't know if you can see yourselves or not. I'm hoping you can't. Right, so this is basically a chapter of what will be a book. It was my PhD dissertation or thesis. It's currently slowly becoming a book. This is chapter 1, and it's even just like one tiny part of chapter 1. Honestly, there's a lot to cover with Islamization and conversion and this thing called religious code switching that I sort of noticed in the sources, and then it sort of had to become a thing. So there's an article out about it, and now I'm trying to sort of mesh this back into the book. So I definitely would appreciate any advice or suggestions or ideas about how to do that once we get down into this. I'm going to go through one source in quite a bit of detail, the Jami or Summa Theologia Arabica, because it's an unedited and untranslated manuscript. So there's a few bits that I'll go through in a lot of detail with that. And then everything else will sort of probably brush through mostly, just so that you get a sense of the context for that and the wider array of sources. So yeah, that's why some of these sources will be a bit more covered than others. So I'm going to start with some context and some definitions. So as I said, this is definitely part of a larger work in progress, and the book itself is on the Islamization of the medieval Central Islamic lands, so Levant, Iran, Iraq, Arabian Peninsula, and it's discussing Islamization in the context of interreligious marriage, so family groups and social dynamics within those groups, and how this may have either encouraged or discouraged Islamization depending on what geographical area people were in, or what type of things like religious inheritance different families might follow. Just for the record, when I talk about Islamization, I'm talking about the adoption of Muslim behaviors, language, and culture. And when I say conversion, I'm talking about the adoption of either an outward or an inward affiliation with the Muslim community. And you'll see why I'm talking about an outward or inward one in a bit. And of course, the system of belief. So when people talk about conversion within the medieval period in the Central Islamic lands, they tend to assume conversion more often than I think it may have actually been happening, is basically the whole point of this talk. There seemed to have been a series of behaviors that people would do in public that were either polite or maybe had some sort of ulterior motive for blending in, or were natural forms of assimilation that previous historians have sort of taken to be conversion. And I'm not sure that's necessarily the case. And of course, there are also situations like women married to men who converted to Islam, who are then assumed to have converted. And that is why sometimes conversion, I'll take it as an adoption of an outward form of belief, not necessarily an inward one. But we'll talk about all this a little bit more as we keep going. Basically, the point of all of this is understanding how blended Christian and Muslim urban families negotiated these identities. Particularly when raising the next generation. So this is the first chapter of thesis turned monograph. So here's what comes after this chapter, just so that you know where this is all heading in the long run, because I would definitely love some feedback about how to merge these things together. The rest of the chapters are about interreligious marriage between Christians and Muslims in the 8th and 10th centuries, both using Muslim and Christian source material. I try to do it fairly equally, and how this may have been related to conversion or a lack of conversion, because there are fairly late dates now that have been agreed upon for a conversion in Central Islamic lands, much later than Bullitt. So interreligious child rearing and blended families are sort of the last two chapters. Discussions of education, like how these children may have been educated, what religious identity they might have inherited if they had one Muslim and one Christian parent, for example, and whether or not different initiation rituals would have been carried out. So things like baptism or circumcision, and why they might have been chosen. So religious code switching basically, I think, explains behaviors in the source material, examples that you're about to see. But it also was likely a part of how interreligious families would have interacted amongst each other. And the same goes for any close social situation, such as friends or colleagues. So there's all sorts of things that I still am really hoping to write articles on about inheritance patterns in terms of, parents with children of different religious affiliations, or things like how employers and employees would have interacted. We have a really interesting example with the neo-martyr narrative of Elias of Damascus. That's not in this particular section, but I'm happy to talk about that later in terms of other social dynamics in which religious code switching might be a useful sort of category for inquiry when trying to understand Islamization. So the definition, religious code switching is any speech act, change in appearance and or participation in a social or religious ritual by those who identify with one religious community in the social or religious utterances, dress, or rituals of another religious community. So Christians doing Muslim things or Muslims doing Christian things, basically, but in a much more specific language. Primarily, it seems to have been a social act that was performed either through ambiguous speech, so saying things that would make you appear to be in one group or another, or physical action, doing things that would make you appear to be in one group or another. And this can involve praying, attending festivals, or circumambulating objects, which of course is a type of devotional practice that existed in the medieval Near East. Religious code switching really complicates previous understanding of conversion in the source material, because rather than being one thing or another, or even going back and forth, it sort of implies that people are complex beings and that they really have many different backgrounds and motivations and personal ties and emotions, and they're complicated messes just like we are today, as opposed to sort of seeing them as more static cardboard cutouts, I think is sort of how conversion tended to be looked at a little bit in the past. The motive for religious code switching is really difficult to assess. So obviously it's almost impossible to figure out why we're seeing reports of people who are acting either Christian or acting Muslim, and trying to understand why they're acting in this way when they clearly don't identify in this way is almost impossible. So the motivations are, you have to go with speculation with that. It's kind of hard to go anywhere else. But it's something interesting to think about anyway. It's a good thought project in terms of understanding conversion. So let's get into some examples of religious code switching. Before we do specific textual examples, I do just want to make one sort of sociological point. There are a couple of sociologists that I think make excellent points about how identity is formed and how people enact identity, which is relevant to our medieval source material. And I only point this out because, again, I think there's been a tendency in the past when people look at conversion. Recently, Karen Bauer and Thomas Carlson and Oriel Simonson have changed this a bit, but historians didn't tend to sort of assume that people could be really dynamic. So Bernard Lahire says that social agents are not made all of one piece. They're fit together from separate parts, complex charts of dispositions to act and to believe, which are more or less tightly constituted. And this does not mean that they lack coherence, but rather that they lack a principle of unique coherence of beliefs, models, norms, ideals, values, and dispositions of act. So an easier, Peter Burke sort of articulates this in a slightly easier to understand, less jargony way. One can have a lot of different roles within a group. You can be both a husband and a father, or a son and a brother within an extended family group, or you can be both a task leader and a social emotional leader in that same group. And I think this can very much apply in social situations where where they're interreligious. So if you happen to be a sibling of a Muslim, but you're not a Muslim in a gathering of other Muslims, then you're going to act really differently than if you're on your own in a situation with just Christians, or you may feel quite torn if you're in a group with both Muslims and Christians in that type of environment. So this is just a really basic example to say that people could have really complex identities even in the medieval period, and I think it's a mistake to assume that they might not. So also I should say that those theories are very similar to ones that Eric Robillard has used to suggest that early Christians in North Africa often performed one religious affiliation or another, both genuinely and for specific purposes in the 3rd through 5th centuries. And I think if any religion can really be taken as a potential model for Islamization or for conversion to Islam, it's certainly the fellow monotheistic faith of Christianity. The potential for a person to have multiple identities, occasionally enacting one or more of these identities in a given social situation, could explain some of the ambiguous actions described in the textual sources which we're about to go through. And this type of behavior would be natural for people with interreligious families, which is what this larger work is all about. And at times they may have felt closer to one tradition or another, depending on the frequency with which they interacted with relatives of other faith groups. So I'm going to go through a few sort of theological texts first, and then we're going to go through a couple hagiographical ones. And there's going to be Muslim examples to contextualize thrown in throughout, because of course we're talking about Near Eastern Christianity, both Melkite and Syrian Orthodox. I don't think there are any examples today from the Church of the East, but that's just chance. I just chose a handful of examples. So the author of the Jami' al-Wujuh al-Iman, commonly known in English scholarship as the Summa Theologia Arabica, a Palestinian Christian text from the 860s, rather precisely describes religious code switching and suggests that these people should no longer be considered Christian. He's really trying to create a divide here because they display Islamic tendencies in public. So he's saying, okay, they shouldn't be Christian anymore. Obviously, monks were purists when it came to enacting religious identity, and he complains of people who he calls mudhabdhabun, or waverers. So these are our waverers. They're a group of Christians who are born among them, specifically referring to Muslims, grew up among them, and were educated in their culture with the result that they hide their faith and divulge to them, the Muslims, only what is acceptable and agreeable to them, and practice terrible dissimulation. He says they will only utter what their Muslim lords and masters agree with and what they don't take offense at. So here he's complaining about people who agree with Islamic declarations of faith concerning Jesus and the Trinity. And he says, you know, again, they're only going to utter what their Muslim lords and masters agree with. He then proceeds to correctly analyze and paraphrase Quranic material while making his point. That chapter is really interesting. So he complains about these people who are educated in a Muslim fashion and act too Muslim. They've learned adab, right? They've not just learned how to read the Quran and good Arabic, but they've also learned how to act Muslim. So he complains about that, and then he uses the Quran as his proof text for how you can tell that these people are doing this. So it's kind of interesting in itself. So moving on to chapter 14 of the Jami, or the Summa, he talks about tenets that exclude people from being Christian. This is the whole chapter of chapter 14. It's people who we shouldn't consider Christian anymore. And he addresses the misleading statements of faith these mudhabdhabun, these waverers, are guilty of using as follows. So he often quotes this Gregory of insert place here. It's spelled differently in the two manuscript copies that I've looked at. So if anyone has any insights on that, I would love to hear it. So Gregory says in his treatise on the faith, whoever says that the Messiah took on humanity as one of the prophets and does not confess that by his becoming man through the Virgin, by means of this, he became Son of Man, the one who was born in Bethlehem and was raised in Nazareth, brought up by God's power for a number of years, and he was baptized in Jordan. The Father attested to this, saying, he is my beloved. Whoever opposes any of this, let them be excommunicated. So he takes this very seriously. These people listed within his sort of third grouping of those who are not Christian in this chapter and should be excommunicated sound as if they are appeasing common Islamic sentiment concerning Jesus. They are saying that he was a prophet and leaving out the more elevated Christology of Melkite Christian belief. So here the phrase becoming man through the Virgin appears to allude to the Christian interpretation of the word taking on the flesh rather than Jesus simply being Mary's son, a concept that Muslims would agree with, that second bit. The author of the Summa is claiming that Christians should elaborate fully on Christ's divinity as part of the Trinity every time they talk about it, which seems a bit unrealistic even now. So towards the end of this third group that he wants to excommunicate, he lists another interesting category of people who should not be counted as Christians. And again, he's quoting this Gregory. So Gregory said concerning the incarnation of God, the Word, that whoever said that the body of the Messiah was without the soul of God and without the intellect of God, and does not confess that he was whole in all things and one being, as what was written, so let them be excommunicated. So these people seem to be saying that Jesus was completely human, having no more essence of the divine in him than anyone else. He certainly is not part of the Trinity if cut off from God's soul and intellect. So again, this would agree with the Islamic concept of Jesus as a prophet only. So he's talking about Christians who are saying this. He's observing Christians saying this. He knows there's Christians who are saying this, and he's saying they cannot be considered Christian anymore. He's trying to cut them out. So again, regarding Christology, the author of the Summa claims that his waivers are following the Christological beliefs of their Muslim friends and colleagues, even alluding directly to the Quranic surahs 517, 4171, and 573. So for 4171, this is basically one of the verses that says Jesus is God's messenger, do not say three. For 517, it's a verse proclaiming that Jesus and God are definitely not the same. And for 573, it's very anti-Trinitarian. So it starts with unbelievers are those who say God is the third of three. These passages obviously show an Islamic opinion of Christianity from a 7th century prescribed perspective. And the Quran in and of itself is not proof of what Muslims tended to proclaim verbally in the 9th century, of course. Rather, it reflects the cultural trends of its own compilers, but the author of the Summa could read and understand Arabic. This person knows the Quran in and out. It's entirely possible that he had been exposed to Quranic recitation at some point in his life. It seems like he's actually been educated in the Quran. And his knowledge of the Quran does not necessarily lead us to believe that his waivers were based on anything specifically observed, although realistically these speech acts likely were observed. So he might be making this up. He might be looking at the Quran and then making up what these Christians are saying, but I don't think that's what's happening. And we'll see in the other texts from different parts of the Islamic world examples of this and why I don't think that this is something that he's making up, but it matches quite well to these Quranic verses. So additional context for the Summa's complaints of Christian speech acts exists in texts such as the Chronicle of Ziknin, which is a Christian work, and Jahiz's Rad against Christianity, though written by, the Chronicle of Ziknin is written by a very biased Syrian Orthodox monk. It appears to accurately portray the average Muslim prods at Christian views of Jesus in northern Syria. So it's quite good for that. Jahiz's Rad also provides contextual evidence, especially because, as I'll discuss a bit later, it was potentially written less for propagandistic purposes and more for either a frustrated local elite or group of elites who were paying him to write it, or possibly Jahiz's personal issues with Christians. He often writes very tongue-in-cheek. He tends to be a satirist. So the things that he's discussing, he blows out of proportion, but they're usually, it seems like they're based in some kernel of reality. So as these texts come from a slightly less theologically elite background, they can be used to provide context for the complaints of the Summa author about Christian speech acts, as they have more potential to address observed behavior. So while it's possible to say, okay, the Summa is really intellectual, it's just going through the Quran and finding things that Christians might say, and then saying, okay, Christians definitely should not say this. When you look at it together with the Chronicle of Ziknin and with Jahiz, and there are a few other texts as well, it becomes clear that actually there are Christians who are saying these things and who think that this is okay, and don't seem to have much of a problem with doing this. And that's just, I find that really interesting, right? They're clearly doing something that I'm labeling as code switching, and other people are saying, okay, this makes them not Christian. This is a type of conversion. We have to get rid of people who are doing this. So significant Muslim debate texts concerning the nature of Jesus, just previous and contemporary to the Summa, such as Al-Qasim ibn Ibrahim's Kitab al-Rad and Isa al-Waraq's Rad, to name only two, tend to heavily incorporate the concept of the Trinity into discussions of the nature of Jesus. So this is also a high-flying theological elite discussion. And they fully immerse themselves in the theological language and concepts of Christian Christological debate, as well as attempting to disprove the idea that Jesus was the son of this shared monotheistic divinity. Al-Qasim ibn Ibrahim refutes the concept of a co-equal Son and Holy Spirit alongside the divine, while Isa al-Warraq, writing around the same time as the author of our Summa or Jami, but in Baghdad, refutes the doctrines of the Trinity and incarnation in detail against Melkite, Assyrian, and Syrian Orthodox beliefs. So these are high-flying. The last two are the very elite theologians writing about this. And then with the Chronicle of Zaknin and Jahiz, I think represent something slightly different, more observed behaviors, even if they're sort of mocking or exaggerating these observed behaviors. So it seems that there's different levels of society in which these behaviors and discussions are occurring. So the Summa incorporates the concept of Trinitarian belief in the first chapter. So we're jumping back to chapter 1, suggesting that the waverers completely dissociate themselves from the Trinity in order to match more closely the belief of their Muslim counterparts. But they say, and what they say to those with whom they are speaking are contradicting the Christians characterized by unbelief. So Muslims characterize Christians as unbelief, so they're contradicting Christians. And enmity towards God in their Muslim scripture. And then he quotes the Quran directly, 5:17 and 5:73. They have disbelieved who say that God is the Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, and they have disbelieved who say that God is one of three in a Trinity, and that Christ is the Son of God. So, however, in the 14th chapter, when our author is describing people who should be excommunicated, Trinitarian language is somewhat implied, but is not explicitly stated as part of the initial set of offensive sort of speech acts. So they're not making themselves assimilate with Muslims too much in this way. The focus is more on the nature of Jesus himself and where he fits into the Christian belief system. Very little is said about the Holy Spirit in the context of his waverers or his muzabdabun, except when he denounces a group of people most likely associated with what he would consider the waverers who do not claim that Jesus had the soul or intellect of the divine within him. So even here, the term is not the usual term for Holy Spirit, but he only says soul or ruh. While the Holy Spirit is mentioned numerous times elsewhere in the work, there seems to be a dearth of complex Trinitarian discussions surrounding the speech acts that can be linked to his description of waverers. So even the author of the Jami is sort of simplifying this, which makes me think that he's observing people saying it, that he's not just making it up, because he could make it really complex if he wanted to. He's capable of that. They seem to simply be avoiding mention of Jesus as the Son of God, as well as the concept that he is in any way part of a Trinity. And this may imply that the statements our author potentially overheard these people using mainly emphasize the nature of Jesus as distinctly not a son of the divine. And if this is true, he ignores the more wider complex nature of Muslim Christian debate in this area, focusing more on what a wider range of actual people with varying levels of education and understanding of theology might comprehend and repeat or explicitly disagree with in the presence of Muslims. It also rules out the possibility that the statements discussed below apply to other types of Christianity. They seem to be explicitly addressed towards an assimilation with commonly evidenced Muslim issues concerning Christian belief. So interestingly, the first speech act, can you go back up? There we go. The first speech act potentially associated with his waivers in the 14th chapter seems to match much more closely with the less theologically oriented final section of the Chronicle of Zaknin and the trend of theology in Jahiz's Rad than with the complex Christian Muslim debate text. So again, I really think he is observing these behaviors. So these are two texts which notably focus quite a bit on forms of Christian Islamization and conversion, both to and from Islam. And both of these works omit Trinitarian theology when either mentioning Muslim jabs against Christian beliefs and attempting to disprove the Christian view of the nature of Jesus, respectively. Their comments or reported comments concerning Jesus's general nature emphasize the lack of divinity in Christ and leave out the rest, something that one might expect of those less educated or less interested in explicit theological debate. So this is the Chronicle of Zaknin. The reports of Muslim jabs at Christian views of Jesus are included in the final section of this Zaknin Chronicle, the one original to the author. So part of the Chronicle of Zaknin wasn't written by the author, it's just sort of a copy of previous texts. And this bit of it was actually written by what the author observed in his lifetime. It sits near the story of Cyrus of Haran in the section on apostates, and he seems to be reporting things he has heard of Muslims saying to Christians, rather than elaborating on any intricate theological points. Despite his identity as a monk, the author of the Chronicle of Zikmin, he probably wasn't highly educated, and according to Amir Harak, based on a note found in the manuscript, may well have been a stylite before being removed from his pillar. So therefore, he would have devoted more of his time to prayer and meditation than education, because it's a bit hard to interact with other humans when you're up there. His lack of education is evidenced by the poor grammar of the Chronicle, and it is possible that a higher theology may have been completely out of his reach intellectually. However, he's obviously able to read and compile the majority of his chronicle based on past reports and write the final section from personal memory and things heard from others. And that's where this is from. This is from that original section where he's describing what he's interpreting as people converting to Islam and what they had to do, as well as what Muslims tended to say to Christians generally. So that's what he's sort of going through this here. This is actually a much longer section. If you want the whole excerpt, I can put it in the chat later after. It was just too much to put into one bit. So he's basically talking about people who he thinks have converted. It happened, as we said to you, that numerous people converted to paganism and renounced Christ, baptism, the Eucharist, and the cross, through which every human being was granted salvation. They renounced all the things that are part of Christ's program of salvation, only confessing that Christ was the Word and the Spirit of God. As soon as someone asked them, this Word and Spirit of God in Isa, what is it? They blasphemed, saying he is like Moses, Elijah, and Muhammad, the prophet who is a founder of the Muslim faith. He is simply a prophet like other prophets, a man like you and me. But then they professed that he was not born from a human seed like anyone else, but they denied him any divine substance and only called him Word and Spirit of God and prophet, and one not born from the seed of man. Instead, God ordered Mary, and she conceived him as the trees are pollinated to produce fruit without the intervention of a male, since they are pollinated by the wind. So he's interpreting some interesting things from this. He thinks these people are converted because of what they're announcing, which that may well have converted, but he doesn't actually describe anything that Muslim texts that are contemporary to this would claim are conversion. So he's describing something totally different. He's just describing like a dissociation with beliefs, and it's hard to tell exactly what he's talking about here. And the way he describes Muslims talking about Jesus, or these people who have recently converted, talking about Jesus, converted in big quotation marks, because I'm not sure that that's actually what's happening. It just looks really similar to the Summa, right? It's the same type of issues coming up again and again. And this seems to have been a very common conversation that if you think about Jack Tanusa's Simple Believers, or the average person and how they would have understood their faith, and they could easily have said things like this as throwaway comments, being polite, having a conversation, maybe they're in a weird social situation. But the author interprets these Christians to be converting, but it's unclear exactly what it is that he's witnessing here. So one should note the statement he places in the mouths of Muslims, which is most significant to contextualizing the Jami or the Summa. He is simply a prophet like other prophets, a man like you and me. And this statement, likely written less than 100 years earlier in northern Syria, really closely parallels the speech acts of religious code switching as mentioned in the 14th chapter of the Summa. So both of these statements allude quite directly to Quran 4171 and suggest that this particular passage may have been really well known amongst even the slightly less theologically educated Muslims and Christians at the time. It seems to have been fairly common. The clear association of this group of people with the Quranic passage, as well as reported speech of Muslims, would suggest that here the author is referring to his waivers, again, sort of just reinforcing this in chapter 14. You just see so many parallels amongst different texts, even from different types of Christianity. So what would statements about Jesus as a prophet really mean to the average Christian? And think Jack Denuse's Simple Believers again. You know, if you think about how much the average person might have been educated, are they really going to understand what they're saying and the implications of this? It's hard to know. And did the monks or clergy writing these theological discussions of waverers or apostates actually understand what was going on? Are they just using these examples to create boundaries? Because if people are mixing, which it seems to be, there's a lot of, you know, mixture in these urban areas between different religious groups, people are going to say things that don't necessarily fall into line with what a monk thinks they should be saying, and they're going to have relationships with people of other faith groups that a monk may definitely not approve of. So these could just be examples of things they've overheard that they're using to try to put a wedge and create a boundary between the two communities. So rather than being clear-cut, all of these statements could portray a multitude of possible actions that may or may not have had symbolic value to the monks describing them or to the Christians saying them. The possibilities are just so many. However, given the social milieu in which these speech acts are occurring, it seems most likely that they were either spoken in sincere belief, unaware that their low Christological statements technically agreed with the faith community other than their own, or politeness when speaking with a Muslim or those with a known lower Christology than them. Possibly even someone who is Jewish or inclined more towards that faith, or purposeful attempts to appear more Muslim leaning in their beliefs than they actually were. It could be any of these things, right? It's impossible to tell what the motivations behind this are. But regardless, all of these actions are covered by the concept of religious code switching, which can be either intentional or unintentional, and merely functions as a term for this ambiguous gray area of social interactions. That mentions of speech acts such as these can be isolated and analyzed in terms of Islamization, as opposed to things that we ignore or just interpret as definite forms of conversion. I think we just need a box to put them in, and that's what I'm really using religious code switching for. So this is the final sort of Christian example. And this is a hagiographical example, the narrative of Bacchus the Younger. So Eastern Christian hagiography often uses martyr lives for multiple reasons. They're polemic against Islam, mimetic of everyday social situations in an effort to be didactic or educational to those listening. And their compositions also for the purpose of worship. So in this narrative, as you can see from this sort of chunk on the screen, Bacchus is the child of an interreligious family. His mother was Muslim. His father was Muslim, sorry, while his mother was Christian. He chose to become a monk as an adult, despite what is commonly taken during his lifetime and where he lived to be an Islamic law calling for him to identify as Muslim. This isn't true everywhere, and that's a whole different chapter of the book. And he's ultimately discovered and martyred for apostasy. For our purposes, though, it's Bacchus's mother and the man sent to search for Bacchus and the rest of his family that are way more interesting than Bacchus. So yeah, these two people are incredible. So his mother plays a really significant role in the plot as a social example to readers or listeners of a passive convert to Islam who manages to remain privately Christian. Her husband converts to Islam after they're married. So she marries a Christian and then her husband converts. And it's sort of assumed that she converts with him. So the martyrdom never states outright that she converts to Islam, but it does say, as you can see at the bottom, that she attends church secretly and she asks God to separate her from foul intercourse with him and that she and her children might join the Christian church. Melchites didn't believe in divorce. She is wishing her husband to die. That is what she is praying for in this quote. One of my favorite quotes from any neo-martyr narrative. I think it's really bizarre. So this holy Christian lady is begging for her husband's death. And then we have an issue with secret Muslim spies, which also comes up in this Vita and is really bizarre. So later in the Vita, you have an abbot mentioning a behavior that could be considered religious code switching. He admits that he's hesitant to baptize and tonsure Bacchus when he does convert due to a fear of secret investigations from the Arabs. So when Bacchus asks to be baptized and tonsured, the author basically says he's worried about spies. He's worried about people who are going to come in and see that he's tonsuring someone that used to be a Muslim and that he's going to be killed for this, or at least in a whole lot of trouble for this. And these secret investigations that he's aware of directly implies secret investigators. So one wonders exactly who these people might be if they actually existed. So the setting here is a monastery, and the secret investigator in a monastery, I suppose, could be someone who's participating in religious code switching in the sense that they're Muslim and they're appearing Christian and going into monasteries and like watching baptisms and participating as if they were part of the community, but maybe they're secretly not, and that's absolutely possible. But it also could just be someone who's Christian who's known to be, you know, a bit of a tattletale. But assimilation of any kind would have been disapproved by monastics. So the person who's trying to gain some benefit from telling on people who are converting to Christianity probably would be assimilated a little bit more firmly, right? Although admittedly, this statement could also have been inspired by Christians, again, occasionally betraying their fellows to Muslims for their own benefit. It's really hard to know who these spies would be, these secret investigators. The author confirms the abbot's fears as legitimate by claiming that the Muslims sent out a man to perform secret investigations to find Bacchus, and the narrative never makes clear whether this character is Christian or Muslim. It never says it's a Muslim acting like a Christian or a Christian who's doing things for Muslims or acting like a Muslim. This character has no firm religious identity. He seems to move seamlessly through both communities, both Muslim and Christian. The Muslims, who Bacchus's sister-in-law has tipped off, which is a whole other interesting thing. She refuses to convert along with the rest of the family, and then she tips off some fellow Muslims who hire this spy only to track down Bacchus. They're not attacking the rest of the family in any way. The rest of the family gets to convert back to Christianity, and no one seems to care. It's just Bacchus they care about, which is interesting in and of itself. I think probably because he's become a monk, and also because it was useful for the narrative. But yeah, there's a whole set of questions in that as well. So anyway, the Muslims who Bacchus' sister-in-law is tipped off respond by calling in a most wicked man and apostate. That is to say, he was believed to be Christian, and sending him to spend time in the monasteries and the churches to deliver in any way the pious Bacchus, being called by them Dahak. And they offered him silver sufficient to pay for murder. So here we begin to see how the author of this martyrdom views the more Islam-oriented Christians who choose to work for Muslims. Maybe that's what he's talking about here, and could have potentially identified somewhat with both traditions. The man who can pass as both Christian and Muslim is compared to the brothers of Joseph who sell him to the Ishmaelites, interestingly, a shared narrative tradition, as for silver, as well as Judas Iscariot. So the author also calls a spy an apostate, though in this particular case, it's pretty difficult to tell whether he's truly converted to Islam, as the term apostate was frequently used to slander enemies of Christianity anyway. So here we seem to have a character who is believed to be Christian working for Muslims by exposing a convert from Islam to Christianity. Later, the author describes the spy doing his work, and it's not very complimentary. As you can see, the knavish man and backbiter. He does things deceitfully, and he bursts in like a savage beast to grasp Bacchus' shoulder when he's praying in the Holy Anastasis. And after, he returns to the back and he begins to shout loudly to Muslims who are around, saying, he's the same tribe as us. Yet this loathsome one became a believer in Christianity, and behold, he donned the monastic garment. So he arrests him then and leads him off to the Emir of the Holy City. And that's when you get this whole martyr narrative of the torture and then not wanting to convert and remaining Christian. So whether he's truly converted to Islam or is merely a Christian hoping to earn some extra cash, the spy blends the boundaries between the two religions. And the author of this text uses the diction to suggest that he's really dangerous. So these are just some of the words. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can see that they're not very positive. It's also interesting how the spy, described in all these lovely phrases, manages to get the attention of passing Muslims who are presumably strangers, because that's not where he's from. Yet somehow miraculously, they understand that this man, while appearing Christian, is definitely Muslim. The statement he yells to these people is really interesting too, because the opening sentence while exposing Bacchus is, "Amophilos min on." He's the same tribe as us. Contextually, this clearly means that Bacchus was once a Muslim. However, this is linguistically a really interesting choice by the author. This narrative is in Greek, by the way. So the author, considering Amophilos, is a word historically connoting kinship. in every sense that it's used. Even when it's used to describe friendship, it implies a friendship based on kinship. So this definitely speaks to some concept that religion was a large part of self and group identification. So while the character of the spy might not be historically accurate, what social behavior or type of person did he mimetically represent? Does he represent a Christian who is interested in the worldly benefits of helping Muslims, or does he act as an example of an active convert to Islam who used his past identity to his benefit? In either intended representation by the author, he's participating in the social act of what I would call religious code switching. He's in this gray area box when he's believably appearing to be Christian and then believably appearing to be Muslim. The spy's motives are presented as being material. He's paid by the Muslims. Yet aside from that, it's almost impossible to tell exactly where this character falls. Is he Christian? Is he Muslim? It is, however, clear that the author considers him to be liminal. That's definitely certain, in a way that leans towards Islam. The spy is vulnerable to Muslim influence while also being extremely dangerous to Christians via his ability to blend in with and for all intents and purposes be Christian in order to discover information they're trying to keep hidden from Muslims for various reasons. So the character provides an interesting window into how clergy and monastics might have viewed and definitely feared lay people or religious elites that are participating in any type of code switching and general social assimilation to Islam or Islamic norms. Like, this is a very polemic character. He's very scary in the narrative. So a contemporary with the Summa is Muslim Ibn al-Hajjaj's, so he dies in 875, it's his Sahih, his hadith compilation. And he also records hadith mentioning people performing actions that could be described as religious code switching. We can talk about the dating of hadith later. Right now, it's more important that Muslim wants to compile these ideas. So these are hadith that he's including in his compilation for a reason, probably they're relevant to his lifetime. It certainly seems that way looking at all these other texts. Even if they are much older, they're relevant for the 800s. So in some hadith collections, the use of the term hypocrite seems to be roughly equivalent to the Christian use of heretic to brand members of the same religion who differ on key theological points, as well as criticizing members of other religious traditions. So it has that twofold meaning. However, while Ibn al-Hajjaj in his Sahih certainly uses this terminology to reflect a group of Muslims who somehow differ in belief from what he perceives as normative, he also seems to include an association between hypocrites and people of the book to some extent. So he reports a tradition from Anas ibn Malik stating, "There was a person amongst us who belonged to the tribe of Bani Najjar, and he recited Surah al-Baqarah and Surah al-Imran, and he used to transcribe for God's messenger. He ran away as a rebel and joined the people of the book, and they gave it much importance and said, 'He is this person who used to transcribe for Muhammad,' and they were much pleased with him." This character was probably Jewish, by the way, if he's from the Bani Najjar. But it's still interesting that he sort of goes back and forth. He converts to Islam, and then he has no real issue for being Jewish as well. The hadith goes on to discuss how this person couldn't be buried in a Muslim grave. That's the purpose of it. But in a hadith that is closely following this one, he describes a hypocrite reporting a tradition quoting from the Prophet, from Ibn Umar. The similitude of a hypocrite, munafiqeen, is that of a sheep which roams aimlessly between two flocks. She goes to one at one time and to the other at another time. And then just below that, there's a different variant. She sometimes finds a way in one flock and then in another flock. So it would appear that Muslim Ibn al-Hajjaj is potentially acknowledging people who perform actions on a spectrum somewhere between vacillation, switching back and forth, and code switching. Christianity was not the only religion concerned with these behaviors, and it's entirely possible, in fact, that Palestinian Melkite Christians were aware of these hadith. They seem, especially the author of the Summa, seems to be very well educated. So both the Summa copied, if not written, at Mar Karaton Monastery in the mid-9th century, and the Palestinian Christian poet and bishop Suleiman al-Ghazi, who flourished in the 10th century, both use variations of the root nafaka to designate people who act unreliably Christian. So this is something that makes its way into the Christian tradition as well. In the case of the Summa, it's used interchangeably, munafikun and mudabdabun, end up being used, he just swaps them. So he calls the muthababun hypocrites when initially describing their behavior. He says, thus act our brother hypocrites, munafiqun, who are among us, before naming them specifically as muthababun a folio later. So it's entirely possible that these two terms and the theological implications they carried were interchangeable for the author in the context of orthopraxy and proper Christian etiquette. They may also have been interchangeable for other people. So I need to go through and do a search of how often munafiqun is mentioned, and in something like Maktaba al-Shamala is sort of in my future, trying to figure out when munafiqun is used in a similar way to muzabtabun. So these are just a few examples from the Ahl al-Malal, which is a fiqh work by Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who dies in 855, but it's preserved by Ahmad ibn Muhammad al-Khalal, who dies in 923. These are main questions that come up, and these are situations in which I think it's fairly safe to say you have people who are code switching in one way or another. So one of the first situations that arises is this question of, can Christian children learn the Quran? And the issue is that there are Christian children who are coming to be educated in a Muslim school, and they're teaching the text of the Quran. And the issue itself is what's important. What Ahmad ibn Hanbal sort of ends up deciding is, yes, they can do that, but they need to learn how to pray as well and treat the Quran properly with the intention of eventually converting them. But that it's happening in the first place is really interesting. The Ahl al-Malal is a responsa. So people are coming and asking Ahmad ibn Hanbal questions, and he's giving them his responses. And these tend to be questions about all aspects of life. So another question he gets asked is, if a Christian admits that Muhammad is prophet, has he become a Muslim, or is he still a Christian? And this again sort of falls into some of the conversations that are being observed by the Summa, by the Chronicles of Nin, by Jahiz. These are conversations that seem to be coming up quite a bit and pose big social problems if you're taking the Shahada to mean that someone has converted to Islam. So if a Christian admits that Muhammad is a prophet, are they Muslim or Christian? And Ahmad ibn Hanbal's answer is, well, if they use the word Rasul, they've converted to Islam. If they use the word Nabi, they haven't converted to Islam. Both of these words tend to be translated as prophet or messenger in English. So it's a bit difficult to make the distinction without using the Arabic words. So that's his answer, but it's the question itself that is really interesting. And the same happens at the end, at the bottom of the slide with, can a Muslim attend a Christian festival? The fact that there are people attending festivals, and this, he goes through a whole list of people who are attending festivals and saying exactly where it's happening in Syria, the person asking the question. And Ahmad ibn Hanbal just announces that there's no harm in it. However, they shouldn't enter the church. So festivals tended to be both markets that were often arranged around an agricultural calendar. So they would have been important markets to go to, but they involved entertainment, they involved revelry, and a lot of the festivals themselves the religious aspects could have involved and would have involved processions outside of the church. There were things that would happen outdoors. So it's just really interesting. Also in the context of Guidetti's recent book about how in Syria in particular, you have mosques inside larger church complexes up until around the 12th century. So yeah, just lots of interesting things to think about in terms of context in which people might code switch and what we might understand to be code switching. Christopher Melchert also brings up instances of shared prayer. So he has a great article about instances of joint Christian-Muslim prayer and their meaning, mostly taken from Abu Nuaym. So his Hilyat al-Alwiya, he has a whole section on joint Christian-Muslim prayer and a discussion of Hassan ibn Atiyah saying amen to a monk's prayer and what this means and what happens when you say amen to a Christian's prayer. What are you assuming? Is this conversion? Are you still Muslim? What are you doing? These are all questions revolving around this activity. You also get Al-Jassas al-Razi in his Mukhtasar with a section discussing Christians who pray with Muslims. Do they become Muslims? This seems to have been fairly common and is actually also attested to in Christian sources, particularly one Christian neo-modern narrative has an explicit discussion of this, Al-Ghassani. So we can talk about that again at the end if you want. So Al-Razi quotes Muhammad al-Shaybani, who dies around 804. If a Christian prays in a mosque or minaret, then they have become Muslim, but if not, they are still Christian. And if a Christian circumambulates the Kaaba, then they have also converted to Islam. But that sort of implies that they're praying and circumambulating other things that might be Muslim, like local shrines of important figures or, graves, things that Christians tended to do anyway. So again, it's the situation, the question itself that's coming up that is really interesting. And a Christian traveling with Muslims who ends up leading them in prayer should apparently be punished, but not expected to convert. So this is just before I conclude Jahiz's little rant about observable behavior that Christians are doing. So as regards influence, power, and position in society, we all know that Christians ride pedigree horses, hold riding tournaments, and play polo, which they're not theoretically supposed to do. This is acting like Muslims. They comb their forelocks fashionably, so they've got like a nice fringe going on, and dress sharply in double-breasted tunics tailored from blended fabric. So they're dressing like Muslims. They even employ bodyguards. They call themselves good Muslim names like Hassan, Hussein, Abbas, Fadl, and Ali, about the only names left which they do not have appropriated, which they have not appropriated, are Muhammad and Abul Qasim. So here we have Jahiz doing his thing, but sort of observing that Christians are behaving in specifically Muslim ways, adopting Muslim names. So finally, conclusions, and it's a very simple conclusion. Really, I just want to figure out and articulate how we can use this concept of religious code switching, these gray areas that don't appear to really be conversion, but are something else, to understand how families like this might have lived. This is a report, it's part of the responsa from al-Malal. So al-Marwazi comes and says that he says to Abi Abdullah, so that's Ahmad ibn Hanbal, what do you say concerning a Muslim man and a Christian man living in a house together, right? Two families living together, and they both have children. We didn't know the son of the Christian man from the Muslim. So he's gone to visit and he can't tell these children apart. These two families are living together. One's Christian, one's Muslim. Presumably the men are brothers, or maybe the wives are sisters. And he says they're compelled to Islam. Compelled here doesn't mean make them be Muslim. It means they are pulled inwardly to become Muslim. They'll naturally become Muslim, and it has to do with concepts of fitra, which I can answer in the questions. But really, it's this family situation that I find so fascinating. And there appear to have been loads of family situations like this. And I'm hoping religious code switching can at least answer some questions about how they would have lived and what they would have believed and what type of religious practices they might have participated in. So, thank you.